Right, okay. You lot, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can catch all of our videos. And if you're really interested in the Krays, join our private Facebook group, Krays Crime Lords of London. You'll find over 1,000 videos and thousands of images. We're moderated and friendly. Come and give us a try.
I know I haven't had the pleasure of walking the streets of the East End for over a quarter of a century, but I still know what goes on, and from what I hear, characters of the type that punctuated my childhood and youth no longer exist. Different times breed different people, I suppose. One of the men we looked up to was Jimmy Spinks, an old-time fighter who epitomized the tough East Ender. Known as the Governor of Hoxton, at 5 feet 9 inches tall, shoulders like an ox, large hands and powerful neck, he looked formidable, and he was. His reputation as a fighter was renowned as well, as the fact that no matter how many he was up against in defense or attack, the only tools he used were his bare fists. His face was a roadmap of knife or razor cuts that bore testimony to the fact that no one dared face him without a weapon. Years later, I would become friends with his nephew, the equally formidable Lenny the Governor McLean. There were so many similarities between the two, it was almost like reincarnation. By the time we got to know Jimmy Spinks, his fighting days were behind him, and he was content to sit outside the Spread Eagle public house in Shoreditch, with sleeves rolled up and held in place by old-fashioned armbands around his huge biceps. As kids, Ron and I would often sit with him and listen to his stories, and he'd buy us lemonade or take us to the sweet shop next door and treat us to a handful of silver foil-wrapped chocolate coins. Wassel was another character we'd see outside the pub more often than not. Thick-set, barrel-chested and dressed immaculately. In his career as a villain, he didn't give a fuck for anyone and would return any slight upset or violence tenfold. One lunchtime, in the local pub, he got into an argument with the boxer Albie Day, a contender who fought in the stable of Jack Solomon's. It didn't come to blows, but later, as Wassel was relieving himself in the toilet, Albie crept in, caught him unawares, and with a crafty right-hander, knocked him to the floor. Thinking he'd had the last word, Albie went back to the bar and resumed his drinking. 10 minutes later, he had a chain coiled around his neck and found himself being dragged from the pub like a dog. Wassel had recovered, gone through a side door and taken the heavy chain from a cart outside. Once Albie was on the pavement, he soon learned the difference between fighting in the ring and fighting in the street. On another occasion, Wassel politely suggested to the owner of a local fish and chip shop that a weekly pension for himself might help in keeping the shop in one piece. Equally politely, the shopkeeper declined the offer, so without further argument, Wassel reached into the window where a cat was sunning itself, grabbed the animal by the neck and threw it into the fish fryer. He got his payment. These and many other respected villains of the day we got to know through our father. Although he wasn't a villain himself, or a fighting man in the same sense as they were, Dad spent a lot of time in their company. Not that he couldn't have a scrap if the situation arose with a drink inside him. He could be a right handful. One night, him and Aunt Rose's husband Billy Wiltshire went out for a drink together, got into an argument with some other blokes and finished up hammering the lot of them. At that time, my parents lived in a couple of upstairs rooms in a house while Uncle Joe occupied one of the lower rooms. 3 o'clock in the morning, a copper from Old Street Nick came banging on the door. He wants to know that as they've got the old man and Bill locked up, would Joe like to come and bail them out? Because he had the hump at being dragged out of bed in the early hours, Joe said, "No, I won't. Fucking well, keep them for a week and shut the door on your way out." Mum didn't know anything about it until the old man came home the following afternoon with the raging hump at Uncle Joe. It's not surprising that Ron and I learned to settle differences with others by resorting to violence. We were surrounded by it. If I described every fight one or the other of the family got into, these stories would last forever on their own. I could imagine that in other areas where society was different, a fight of any description would be a shocking thing, something to talk about for weeks. But where we came from, it was common enough to be hardly worth noting. I can remember Grandad Lee having a row with a neighbour, George Connor, who lived on the corner. At first it was just angry words, and then Grandad swung a right, caught George squarely on the chin, and knocked him sprawling in the street. If Uncle John hadn't come along and physically carried Grandad away, God knows what further damage he would have inflicted. Even family was not allowed to get away with liberty-taking. Grandad had an argument with his brother Tom, but it seemed to be settled, and he forgot about it. He'd been out for a bicycle ride and was just leaning the bike against the wall when up the road came Uncle Tom. As he came past, a neighbour shouted, "Look out, Jimmy! This fella's got a lump of iron behind his back." Uncle Tom was going to attack his own brother with an iron bar. I suppose it was the weapon that upset Grandad most. He ran to meet Tom, grabbed the bar, and flung it up the street, then set about him until he was unconscious in the gutter. It took 4 blokes to hold Grandad back. Otherwise, he might have killed his own brother. No law got involved, but they didn't speak to each other for many years afterwards. This Uncle Tom, or I should say great uncle, was a bit of a character in his own right, and according to family stories, was a bit slippery. In his younger days, he lived near and was friendly with the Bristol bantamweight boxer Pedlar Farmer. Pedlar had had a crack at the world title, but he was knocked out by Terry McGovern in what was then the briefest title fight in ring history. Somebody gave Uncle Tom half a dozen expensive silk shirts to pass on to the boxer, but after weighing up the risks against a few quid in his own pocket, he decided that Pedlar, with all his money, wouldn't need a few extra shirts, so he sold them off. As often happened in the close-knit community of the East End, word got back to the boxer, and Uncle Tom had to keep his head down for a long time, as the threat was made that he would be put down the sink by Pedlar and his mob. Another time, he wasn't so clever either. He was working as a foreman at Poole Wharf with half a dozen men under him when he was approached by a very smartly dressed man. The man explained that he leased one of the buildings on the wharf, but unfortunately had lost the key. Trouble was, it was urgent for him to remove some goods he had in storage. At the same time, he made it clear that once the door was unlocked, he would be looking to hire some men for a few hours to help with the loading, and he said the men would be well looked after. Uncle Tom, who could never turn down the chance of a few extra bob, nearly fell over in his haste to help the man. By the time the man returned with a large van, Tom had made himself busy. The padlock was smashed off, and the workers were standing by the door, ready to go to work. While the man sorted the furs that the warehouse contained, the 6 men under Tom's orders formed a chain and loaded the van until it couldn't hold any more. All finished, a new padlock was fixed to the door and lining the men up. The fur trader thanked them, shook their hands and gave each of them 10 shillings, with an extra half-crown for Uncle Tom. They must have cheered him off the dock, because 10 bob was a lot of money then, as you might have already guessed. 2 days later, the real owner turned up. He had to force the new padlock, then called the police. An inspector collared Tom and asked him if he'd seen anyone suspicious loading up stolen furs. Tom replied, "Yes, Governor, a big guy, and we all helped him." Even the female side of the family inherited the fighting genes. Not so much Mum or Auntie May, though they did have a scrap one day between themselves and May ended up with a black eye. But they were young and it was a one-off. But Auntie Rose was a fighter all her life. I loved them all, but Rose was my favourite. With her long black hair, green eyes and fiery temper, she was like an attractive gypsy, and Ron and I spent hours in her company. You could bet if we were not indoors at home, we'd be next door drinking tea and eating biscuits with her, listening to her stories and discussing all kind of topics. If she had half a crown, she'd give away 2 bob to anyone who needed it, just like our mother. But that temper of hers, luckily we were never at the receiving end of it, because she'd loved us since we were babies, but we often saw her lay into others. We'd be sitting in her front room and she'd say, "See them nosy bastards, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so down the road. Next time they give me one of their looks, I'm going to spit in their eyes," and she meant it. Other times, if she saw a copper walking up the road, she'd wait until he was about to pass her door. Then, as though it was an accident, she'd shake a dusty rug in his face. Uncle Joe and her were in a beer house one night in the days when public houses needed a proper license to sell strong spirits. After a while, their mother, Nanny Lee, came in with a friend of hers, went up to the bar and ordered 2 tarts of whiskey. The barman explained he couldn't sell spirits, but she wouldn't listen and kicked up a stink. Her language, as usual, could make a docker blush. "Fucking bastard. If you won't serve us, you can fuck off. We'll go somewhere else." Then Nan and her mate stormed out. The pub was packed, and on their way out, they barged into a couple of blokes. One of them said, "Oh, you mind who you're fucking well shoving?" Joe's not having his mother spoken to like that, so he pushes through the crowd to have a go at the 2 blokes. As they are about to set about Joe, Rose sees it and joins in. But she doesn't go through the crush, she goes over it. She jumped on the bar and then ran over heads and shoulders screaming, "Leave my fucking brother alone." When she reached them, she squared up and punched like a man. The blokes couldn't get out of her way quickly enough. But God help anyone who touched Rose's son, Billy. On one occasion, when he was threatened, she pulled a knife on the other person. As I said before he went in the army, Billy was the scourge of everybody. For some reason or other, he'd upset Billy and Alfie Kray. Whatever he'd said or done must have been serious, because word came back that they were going to give him a good hiding. This time it was Nanny Lee who jumped to his defense. Billy and Alfie each had a stall selling second-hand clothes down the market. So on the Sunday morning, Nan's down there screaming at them like a mad woman. She must have been 75 then, but she certainly put the wind up my 2 uncles. "What's this about you going to do my Billy up? Well, I'll tell you 2 fuckers now. Either of you lay a finger on him, and I'll come back and turn these fucking stalls over." Sadly, Aunt Rose was diagnosed with leukemia, but even that didn't dampen her fighting spirit. She'd been having treatment for the disease, been away for convalescence, and had just come home when she got a visit from a couple of friends of hers, Jimmy Stannard and his sister, both well pissed. An argument had developed, and the sister had got stuck into Rose, who, being under the weather at the time, couldn't do much to retaliate. A couple of weeks later, Mum and Rose were walking down Bethnal Green Road. As they got to the butcher's on the corner, along came the woman Stannard. Outside the shop were trays and trays of eggs, all displayed on the slant. Mum tried to steer Rose away, but all she said was, "Keep out of it, Vi. Now it's my turn." She pushed up her sleeves and punched the woman 3 or 4 times, leaving her sprawled among hundreds of broken eggs. She said to the bloke who owned the shop, an ex-boxer with huge cauliflower ears, get her to pay for the eggs she broke the fuckers. He never said a word. Shortly after this incident, our beautiful Aunt Rose died in the London hospital. Despite being the generous and wonderfully outgoing person she was, inside she was an emotional and lonely woman, even though she was surrounded by family who loved her. We were all devastated to lose her. As a boy, something I got great pleasure from was visiting my grandfather, Jimmy Kray. Gorsuch Street, where he lived, was a turning off Hackney Road and no more than a 5-minute walk away from our house. Usually the front door would be wedged open with a large round stone that was so smooth and shiny, I can only imagine that he had found it by the sea at some time. If the door was shut, all I had to do was pull a piece of string and it would release the latch. In the passageway, An enormous aspidistra plant would seem to reach out and snag my jersey as I walked by. In the front room, where Farvey would be sitting in a large comfortable armchair, the most dominant thing was a highly polished walnut piano. At this time, Farvey, like Grandad Lee, would have been in his 70s and still as tough as they come. We'd have a cup of tea and a few digestive biscuits, and he'd comment on different bits of news from the paper on his knee. Then he'd turn to the sports page and ask me what I thought of Don Cockle's chances against Rocky Marciano, and would I be staying up to listen to the fight on the wireless, which was being broadcast from San Francisco in the early hours of the morning. That would set him off on a train of conversation that I loved. Joe Louis, Max Baer, Primo Carniara, Jack Dempsey. Gradually he'd get further and further back in time as he spoke of this fight and that fight, until he'd be back in the days of Bob Fitzsimmons, James Corbett and Jem Smith, heroes of his own youth. I'd sit there fascinated as he described boxers who, to me, were straight from the history books. It wasn't just stories of his old boxing heroes that Farvey would talk about. He loved to reminisce about his own youth. I was up in his bedroom one day, and I noticed an iron bar sticking out from behind the pillows on his bed. When I asked him what it was there for, he said, "Just in case someone tries to pull a caper like they did with Nosha." Old Nosha Powell, father of the stuntman and referee, wasn't short of money and had a tendency to flash it about. One night, he hung his trousers on the end of the bed with £200 in the back pocket. This cash, a fortune in those days, must have been noticed when he was in the pub earlier in the evening. Later, someone with a lot of nerve, considering Nosha's reputation, got a ladder, climbed into his bedroom, and pinched the money and the trousers. The next day, he accused his best mate Sonny of robbing him and punched him a couple of times. Sonny, who was also a tough old boy, picked up a lump of wood and knocked Nosha unconscious.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.